Well, first, let's look at his contribution. I think the contribution of Rajiv has been varied. He would like to describe himself as an intellectual Kshatriya, which I think sums up his role pretty much accurately. He started off with sort of assessing why we are so different as a civilization from the West. The importance of this distinction, he just underlined very succinctly. Following that, I think he moved on to certain other facets. I'm only talking about the main body of his work. I'm sure there are many more facets there. He moved on to questions of which sometimes in India we don't pay adequate attention to, which is the intellectual challenges to Indian civilization, to the Indic civilization, which has emanated from the West, which is not necessarily benign, but which are quite malevolent. And he summed it up with this word called breaking India. Breaking India, to my mind, may be an overstatement to a lot of people, but I think the important thing is that there is a certain form of emotional and intellectual balkanization which has been taking place in India very, very silently. And it started sometime probably in the 18th, 19th century. Some people would say it started much earlier. But whatever it is, this was not necessarily recognized by India. In the quest for modernity, we sometimes forgot that the very intellectual foundations of our civilization were being undermined. And I think it is to the credit of people like Rajiv that he brought it to the fore, brought it in a very sort of stark fashion, and pointed out how issues such as the separatist movements, the intellectual separatism for instance, on Dravidian ideology, as well as Dalit ideology, what is paraded as equity in some quarters, has a very malevolent effect. Secondly, I think he has pointed out that how with India coming of age economically, and I think that's a very important step, that India is no longer there with a begging bowl. India is moving ahead, carving out a niche for itself in the global economic league. But along with that, what's happening, and this is where he pointed out very well, is that how Indian resources, Indian patronage is being used to undermine India itself. And this has been happening in the campuses of the United States and North America, and maybe in a lesser way in Europe, because Europe doesn't have that much of resources, but the resources are very much there in the US. How this is happening in the US and how short-sighted it is for a lot of Indian notables that you think that you're doing a great thing by making a mark in big American universities, setting up a center named after your corporation or your family or your mother or your father or something like your family name. And that's an important thing, no doubt, in sending up these huge bequests and endowments. But what is being done with money? What is being done with that money is a systematic policy of undermining India in the guise of academic autonomy. And what he is trying to suggest in this way is that it's about time you flex your muscles, you actually ensure that you get a sense of what is being taught and what is not being. And finally, I think in his the final book, which is yet to be published, but which I've had the good fortune of reading a manuscript of, he pointed out the negative effects of international agencies piggybacking on the woke ideology to undermine the education system of India. And I think that's where I'm going to be something which Indian parents should take notice of in a way, because if these ideas parading as, the greatest advances in pedagogy actually managed to get in through UN agencies and other international groups, it's going to be a very, very damaging effect, in terms of our understanding of what is sexuality, in terms of understanding of what constitutes, the critical race theory as applied to the Indian context, which means, setting caste against caste. And this fractures, this divisiveness and a social fragmentation, which can result in all this. So these are the contributions of Rajiv Malhotra. The impact has so far been confined by and large. He has intervened principally in the intellectual debates within North America. That's been his mainstay of his work. His intervention within India has so far been limited or perfunctory. He's been there, he's noticed, people know about him, people have a certain degree of respect for him, he's got a critical following amongst people. But in terms of a very organized way, I think the main impact has been in the campuses of the university, where he's fought a very noble, rearguard, sometimes valiant battles against heavy odds to establish, to put some correctives in place, particularly the distortions of Indian civilization as it exists in the Western campuses. One of the biggest problems which we in India face is that our intellectual traditions are still very much mortgaged to fashion in the West. I call it deliberately fashion because the trends have changed from at one time to a sort of Western form of liberalism to Marxism to present-day wokeism, which all of it has shifted ground. And in between, what has happened is what has drawn them together at different points in time has been a thread which suggests that Indian unity is a contrived one, it's artificial, that ideally India should be broken up into a number of different and conflicting civilizations which are. Now, that's at the root of much of the discourse, much of the dominant discourse which has happened in India. Against this, there is, of course, an official line which is less, which has always tried to be needlessly secular by trying to underplay the Indic and the Vedic aspects of our civilization. What Rajiv has done very succinctly is by pointing out that we have a very clear-cut Vedic inheritance. And that inheritance we need not be apologetic about. And that in the West, that tradition has been assaulted and disfigured in ways which are quite unimaginable. That the manner in which people who teach so-called Hindu theology in the premier Ivy League colleges of the United States are using certain Freudian analysis to exaggerate the notion, to suggest the Indian religion, Hindu religion, what we call Hindu religion, is preoccupied with an overweight of sex. And that this is that the Indian tradition necessarily involves a celebration of perversion. That has been the underlying trend of it. And what he has tried to suggest, and he's not the only one, but he certainly has played a very important role in getting these ideas in a popular way to things. Others have talked about it in more academic discourse, but what he's done, which is one of his best most enduring contributions is that he's also managed to bring these ideas, challenge these ideas in a more in a discourse which is clearly understood by a lot of people, and which is by saying that to read Hindu tradition, Indian Vedic culture, through the prism of certain Western categories without necessarily understanding the inner depth on which these people have, the assumptions on which it is based on, is flawed and constitutes a willful perversion. That therefore you must first inculcate the values, the tradition, and the ethos of the Vedic civilization before being able to comment on it, and that many of these Western commentators lack that ability. That, in a nutshell, is what he's done, and that's a very, very valuable contribution. It may sound very simple, but it's actually a very, very valuable contribution, giving people the intellectual ammunition to challenge what they earlier thought instinctively. A lot of them felt, no, what they're saying is something wrong, but they never had that intellectual ammunition to be able to question someone like Wendy or Wendy Doniger or Jeffrey Kirpal or some people like that. So he's given them that ammunition. To that extent, I think he's done a sterling service to the cause of Indic civilization. Well, certainly in terms of how the diaspora perceives of itself as a self-confident community, I think he has played a very important role in giving the Hindus of North America a certain degree of self-confidence and a belief in themselves and a refusal to be taken for granted or being the victims of condescension or distortion. That challenge to that anything that goes on in the West in the guise of academic freedom will not be unchallenged is a self-confidence which he has given. As far as India itself is concerned, the direct impact of his policy, of his writing, has been less pronounced. But many of the ideas which he's talked about have, in their own ways, he may not be the only person who's spoken about it, but in a direct sort of way, he is well respected, and his books are read, and many of these, particularly over the past 10 years, have been blended in the larger theme of Hindu resurgence in India. The coming of India, what's happened in India is very interesting, is that the mood of the growing economic importance of India has finally merged with the assertion of a large section of Hindus to say that we have a certain inheritance, we have a certain identity which is distinct, and we need not be apologetic about it. The fact that we speak English, that we wear Western clothes at times, does not negate the fact that we are Indians in our own way, and that we are very proud Hindus, that we are inheritors of a civilization, and we proudly assert that relevance of that civilization in the contemporary world. And I think Rajiv has been an important input in that. Well, I don't know how far they can play a role in supporting his vision, but I think the important thing is that he's playing a very important role in creating a certain intellectual climate. He's created a discourse for itself. And the important thing is that that discourse needs to be widely disseminated, debated. Sometimes you may disagree with some aspect of it. That's not the important thing. The point is that it should be debated, that it should be dissected thoroughly, and that it offers an alternative. The important thing is that it offers one of the alternatives to the dominant Western mode of looking at India. that India is not going to be an example of mindless globalization. The so-called global melting pot, which basically involves the American model, coming into India and taking it over lock, stock, and barrel, and Indians just following uh, whatever their profession is not going to happen. And I think I believe that challenge is very important. Rajiv is one of those who's actually established and said a definite no to that and created alternatives. There are others there are various trends which are there. The important thing is that ultimately we have to build an ecosystem whereby all these different strands, whether Rajiv or someone else or, other intellectual warriors, can find a suitable environment within suitable and receptive environment within India. And I think that is a work in progress. It's not been achieved as yet. I believe that Rajiv Malhotra and the Infinity Foundation have taken on a very, very important, brave challenge. In the past 30 years, through his writings, particularly his writings, his patronage of various other scholars, etc., who are there, he has, in his own modest way, and there's a limit to how much one individual foundation can do, but in his own modest way, he has created an important ecosystem of Hindu resistance in North America. Now, the point is, what is Hindu resistance in North America? Translated into India means Hindu assertion. I think the twin themes have got to merge. And I hope in the next decade or so, when we celebrate his 40 years of the foundation, he'll be able to say, look, within India, we can now say that the impact has been almost commensurate with what the impact has been within the diasporic community in North America.